Buonasera everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, in which we will cover the new KineFX Houdini 19 features, like secondary motion tools, as well as some other motion clip features. My name is Mihnea Stoica, I'm a character TD with SideFX software, and that being said, let's jump right in. So as a quick overview related to what we're going to talk about today, the secondary motion tools are a couple of tools that we added for Houdini 19 in KineFX that will allow you to achieve various effects on specific joints of a skeleton. And to better illustrate what we mean by secondary motion, here are a few examples that we will going to take a look at during this HIVE talk. The first one is this a short clip of the running dog, and we can see that the tail is kind of wiggling and waggling left and right as the dog runs and jumps, and the tail is fully animated using these secondary motion tools. Next, we've got Eric on a bike, some nice gravel road underneath, and we can see the bike reacting to the road, and that makes Eric sort of jump left and right and sort of goes with the flow. And Eric's animation is fully achieved using secondary motion as well. And last but not least, we've got this nice example of an elephant. We've got a walking animation, another walking animation, a trip, a fall. It's a fairly complex scene, but in this scene we can see the tail, the ears, the trunk, all have been animated using secondary motion tools. The trip as well is a full body ragdoll, which we'll go into a bit. And this scene is more to illustrate how they can all be layered together to achieve something like this. So once we've gone over the overview, we can jump straight into the first scene, which is the dog example. And for this one, we will be looking specifically at non-simulated secondary motion using the new secondary motion SOP. So now in Houdini, we're going to have a look at the above mentioned scene, slightly overly simplified so we don't get all that noise from the background, so on and so forth. So what we have here is a dog model that we import using FBX. Then we are applying some materials properly. Rig stash posing for the rest transform attribute, which is being used by the secondary motion SOP, or could be, but in this case we want to use it. And then down here we only have like a few motion clip nodes to make the animation fairly slow-mo, so we can see exactly how the effect is being applied. So what we see right now on screen is basically the animation of the dog, exactly how it comes in without anything applied. We see here that we've got just a neutral motion clip that's plugged to our switch, and we see that the tail stays relatively static and doesn't really do too much. Now if I come up here to the switch and I go back or I go forward to input number 1, which will connect to secondary motion SOP up here, which we will go over in just a second. As we start to play, we see we get some of this wiggle of the tail left and right and up, and as it jumps, also this nice curve of the tail as well. So let's have a look at the node. As I mentioned before, this is a new SOP that we added in Houdini 19, and its purpose is to basically allow us to apply specific effects, which we can find down here, lag, overshoot, jiggle, or spring, on a series of joints. In order to achieve that, we have a few parameters that come to our aid, and I will go through them and discuss exactly what each of them do. So straight at the top, we've got active points, which is disabled. It's not really, that's just for the state, so we can safely ignore that one. That's just to help us click on a joint and visualize the motion trail that it's going to create. We can see it gets selected up there, so we can keep track of which one is selected. Next, the joint group. So this is basically which joints we want to influence or which joints we want to apply the effect onto. We can use the selector, of course, to select them, or in the state, if you press S, you get the volatile selector. You can select the ones you want and press enter. Next, we've got the source joint. So in this case, we're using the pelvis, to drive the effect on our joint group. So this is an important point. This SOP, how it operates, is it looks at the attribute that we specify down here, so we're going to go into a second down here, of the source joint, applies the effect onto that attribute, and then drives the other joints with the newly applied effect. So it basically the idea is that we want the tail to be influenced by the pelvis, so we use the pelvis as the source joint. If the source joint is not animated, or if the attribute, in this case local transform of the pelvis, is not animated, then we won't be getting any effects because there's nothing, no delta in the local transform, right, to apply the effect to. So this is an important point. Next up, frame range. So what's the frame range of our clip? In this case, so the default is just to look at the clip info, which for this example is what we want. We can also override this, of course, with whatever else we might want. Moving down the parameter interface, we come to the mode. So we've got two modes here, local transform and other attribute. Local transform is what we're using now, and this will basically apply the effect. So it will read the local transform of the source joint, apply the effect to it, and then apply that delta onto each local transform of the joint in the group. Generally, you would want to stick with local transform when working with hierarchies like we are here. So if we play this a bit, the reason is that, let's go to the jump, that's probably the best we can illustrate. Gonna have to toggle this to see it proper. So local transform gives us this nice propagation of the effect across the whole chain. If we were to only use transform, for example, we won't be seeing this, as each joint would transform in world space and will not propagate the newly updated transform to its children. Hence why local transform is something we would want to use mainly for hierarchies, but not always. We'll see in just a second example here how we're going to use, for example, P. Next, the toggle I just checked, modify in place. So this one will apply the actual effect on the skeleton, on the main input target skeleton up here. The only reason you would want this disabled, as I had it before, is when you're just interested in a motion clip output. And you could be interested in that for various reasons. In this case, I have a motion clip that I'm evaluating downstream anyway, so there's no point in just doing extra computation and applying the results onto the main skeleton as well, since we're going to read the motion clip anyways. Another potential reason why modify in place should stay disabled is if you want to chain multiple secondary motions in a line and you don't really want to be applying the effect onto the skeleton with each one. You could just use this one at the last node in the line, and that's going to work just as right. Next up, we've got the configuration attribute here. So this one will read an attribute as generated by the configure join SOP. We will go over the clear example in just a second. We have it here on the left. And this is basically used to apply rotation limits to any of the joints to prevent it to rotate outside of the range. This is mainly useful if you want to fix protrusions or stuff like that. You know, if you have a rotation that makes the specific part of the skin protrude with the rest, you could apply some limits and limit that. Next up, there's a little toggle here, use respose attribute to apply limits. This only is valid when the limits are enabled. And what this one does is basically tells our node to, instead of using the rest transform matrix that's stored within the dictionary that holds the limits as well. This is also something that the configure joins takes care of. We'll see in a second. It tells the node to instead just use the rest transform we provide up here. So if at some point the rest transform you defined the limits into changes, or you want it to change, you can do so here. Next up, we've got extract transform here. This is a valuable only when working with matrices as attributes. So local transform in this case is a matrix, in which case this actually matters. And this tells the node which components of the matrix we want to affect. So in this case, we have rotation, hence we're getting this rotation of the joints changing. If I go display the skin down here, and we come back and, for example, tick translation as well, then as we play this, we will be getting some translation effects applied. See right here, we get this stretch. This is because right now we're also influencing the translation of the joints, not only the rotation. And scale is the same thing. Again, keep in mind that in order for an attribute or in order to actually affect this component, you have to have on the source joint some animated values for it. So in our case, our scale does not get modified throughout the clip. So enabling scale won't really do anything for this example specifically. Next, we've got effect multiplier. So this is just like a linear multiplier of the effect. So for example, if we come up here, we can see the tail going up. If I change this to like 5, we get 5 times that. So the difference between the effect multiplier and the values we see down here, which we'll go over in a second, is that the effect gets applied linearly after the actual effect has been computed. So we compute the effect with these values down here, and then we take exactly that computation, that delta computation, and we just linearly multiply it by this number right here. So we're going to get different results changing this or that. The reason or when you would want to manipulate the effect multiplier is when you reach an effect that you're happy with. That kind of gives you the result that you're looking for, but you're just looking to intensify it or make it less visible just a little bit or just slightly. In that case, you can play with this slider rather than changing these values and potentially messing up your result. Then we go down to the effects tab. So as we looked at the beginning, these represent which effects we want to apply. For our tail example, we have lag and overshoot. And for each value, we have an option to overwrite it with an attribute. So this was a point attribute that we can read up from our skeleton. And what this will do is for each joint, we'll overwrite the lag value with the one from the attribute. This is useful if, for example, you want to configure like I don't know, 2 sides, left and right sides for like ears or something like that at the same time, and you want some variety in there. You can define an attribute on both points or all joints that are different. So in a single node, you will get slightly different results for the left and right side. And the third option is scale by attribute. It's the same idea, except instead of overwriting these values, we scale them by the value of the attribute. The other effects have their own set of parameters, which I encourage you to like go through and read their help cards, what each of them do. And of course, by playing with them, you'll get to the desired effect. Next tab, we have gravity. So I'll explain this tab in a little bit while we're going to look at this example on the left. And for the blend tab, this is basically the motion clip blend that we're exposing here. And this allows us to make sure that we don't apply the effect on the full frame range up here, but rather only on specific portions that we can blend in and out of it if we so desire. Moving on, to the right here, we have another example. You can switch this to the second one. And now if we play this one, we see we get also a bit of this tail waggling, but it looks slightly different. It's maybe a bit more stiff as well. And this example, as I said before at the beginning, is using P as the attribute rather than local transform. And in order to achieve this sort of all tail motion, well, what we're doing is we're using as a joint group just the tip of the tail. The source remains the pelvis. And under mode here, we have other attribute and we set the attribute to P. We see the extract transform is disabled. It doesn't really matter because since we're not dealing with any matrices, it's not going to make any difference. But now actually, since we're doing with P, we can see that the last joint is in basically its world space position gets affected by the SOP. And we get this kind of jiggly, springy, weird motion that's obviously not really even like staying the same length compared to its parent, so on and so forth. However, this one won't work. If we're trying to apply the effect here, this won't really direct or make our tail behave as we want. So in order to achieve that effect that we just seen, we can use a curve solver here. This repose just moves it slightly closer to the parent, so we get a bit of a more of a bend. And then here we have a solve curve, which just takes the points of the tail, all of them, and runs the solve curve using the control points from the second input. That basically we take what gets affected by the secondary motion and use that as a goal as a control for the solve curve. And this gives us that nice springy tail motion. And then the rest is just for show. So this is another way in which we could use this SOP for a hierarchy. Now, of course, when not dealing with hierarchies, we can really use any sort of attribute here. We don't really have to care about keeping the joints the same length, so on and so forth. We can even use attributes that are not related to any transforms at all. We can use like just random matrices or random float attributes that we can drive with this effect and get our values modified by this SOP. Before we move on, one last example we have here showing that gravity tab that we kind of left out. So we have here a dog. We just added a super basic earring or something like that. And if we look at the animation, we see the earring sort of lagging behind and then falling back onto its head. The setup itself for the earring is very simple. We're just adding a new joint here from the ear. Here we're building this earring from a torus and a box. And we have a capture packed geo in here as well. So we can capture that to the newly added joint. We merge it with the rest of the skin. So with the actual dog itself. And then here on this side, we have a couple of interesting points. So one is, as mentioned before, we can apply limits to the secondary motion. So in this case, we actually want to do that in the configure joints node. We'll go over this node specifically and its state a bit more when we talk about Ragdoll. You can see I've added for this node limits, so it only rotates on the X only negatively. So we don't want it to rotate positively on the X because that's going to make it like go inside the head of the dog. And we don't really want it to rotate on other axes either. So we define this attribute up here. Afterwards, we go down. This rig pose just has some head animation, so we can actually drive our earring animation. And then for the secondary motion SOP, as I said before, joint group is our earring joint. Source is the head, so this one will drive our earring. We have enabled the configuration attribute because we want to read this attribute for the limits, as well as the rest transform because, as we see again, their transform differ. And we've got, for the effects, lag overshoot again with a bit of a multiplier. But what's interesting here is that we're using gravity, and I'll explain that by showing the difference. So we see if we disable gravity, this is the rest, sort of how the earring is aligned to the head. And if we play this animation, we basically get this effect where, since the earring starts as the rest pose over there, as the head moves, it sort of stays with this weird distance from the head, which isn't really realistic and not really gives us exactly what we are looking for. And as it comes back down, it's kind of the same, and you're going to end up with it stopping there. What the gravity allows us to do is allows us to specify an axis, a look at and look up axis of the joints, which in our case is negative Z and X. We can see here negative Z pointing towards technically the child if you'd had one, or this is like the axis we want to orient to the gravity force direction here. And the look up, in our case X, is basically the direction of the twist. So we select these axes, we say which joint we want to be affected by gravity, in our case our earring joint, the gravity force direction, which defaults to negative Y, so it just points straight down. And then this is the blend, which will make our earring point basically at 1. It means that our negative Z axis is now aligned with our world negative Y. So this will make it point straight down, which obviously for our example is a bit too much. So we want to bring it up just a little bit. And what does this mean right now is as we play, it's going to basically get stuck there to the head, giving us a bit of more of a realistic motion of the earring itself. Right, so that being said, this covers all the parameters on the secondary motion SOP. Feel free to experiment with it, try out different effects, and we will come back to this again with the elephant scene, and we're going to take a look how it was applied over there. A few last thoughts on this particular node before we move on. So as mentioned before, one very important bit to always check is to make sure that your source joint has the actual attribute of interest. So the attribute you specify under the mode, which could be local transform, P transform, so on and so forth. Make sure it's actually animated on the source joint to actually get the results. The way the node works, as I described before, is it looks at the delta, so basically the variation of that specified attribute over time, applies the effect on that variation, and then that will get applied on the joint group properly. So in case you don't see any results, try and play with the effect strength first. Maybe your delta is too small with the current default values. If that still doesn't help, make sure that the actual attribute has animation data. Next point, if you're using multiple nodes, multiple secondary motion nodes, or if you're just interested in the motion clip output of the node, then you can turn modify in place off. This will boost the performance just a little bit since the effect doesn't have to be applied on the skeleton anymore. And last but not least, if you want to get more variety, if you want to, for example, use both or apply the effect on both on the left, on the right side of a skeleton, like maybe or the ears or something like that, you could use a single node, define a point attribute upstream, and drive the effect with that point attribute. This is a great way to get a bit more randomization and variety across a specific animation clip. And you could even use this if you're only applying the effects on a single chain and you want each joint to behave a little bit different than its parent. Next scene we'll be looking at is the Eric on a motorcycle scene. And as we've seen at the beginning, his whole body is being driven by the motorcycle that's being driven by the gravel road underneath. For this example, we will be having a look at the new KineFX Ragdoll workflow, which showcases, amongst other things, a physics-based solver. So in Houdini, I'm going to have a look at the setup. So you have here a simplified version of that same scene with Eric on the bike, kind of riding along and his body reacting to what the bike is doing. So one thing I want to mention is that for this example, we're using the new KineFX Ragdoll workflow, which consists of these three nodes, four really, if we take into account the configure joints for defining limits, but this is technically optional. The solver, which is the engine of this whole workflow, is built on top of the bullet solver, which has been in Houdini for a while, and it's actually also being used for ragdolls in crowds. Before we dive into the actual ragdoll nodes, I want to come over here to where we actually process the bike and talk quickly about why this step is required. So we bring in Houdini quite a high poly, 500,000 points model of a bike. We see with all these little parts, and it's a cool model. But we get these concave shapes, which for bullet, that's not ideal. Having too many concave shapes can lead either to a great hit on performance, because bullet then has to create these concave collision objects, which can take a long time to do, or oftentimes can even lead to a broken solve altogether. So to get rid of this overhead, we have here a simple setup where we are, one, killing the animation on the bike, which has been achieved with a nice rig on the bike to get these suspensions and the wheels turning. And then we're just adapting the wheels to the terrain using the Collide Geometry VOP introduced in 18.5. So we're killing the animation on the bike because we want to be making this optimization setup on a non-time dependent stream. We're poly reducing the whole thing, so we get less, about 27,000. We can probably reduce it even more. Then we're turning everything into convex shapes. So we're getting rid of these concave issues and trying to keep everything as bullet friendly as possible. Then we're doing an RBD configure. So the reason we have this node here is, one, we want to pack our model. So you see we have 13 pieces. It's going to get each one individually packed. That's reason number one. And reason number two is we also can define these attributes here, active, animated, as long as some other ones if we're interested in them. So this can be very useful when dealing with objects that, for example, need to go from a state to another. So we want the object to be influenced by physics, or rather be animated, and then at some point switch over to being influenced by the solver, so by physics. Then on this side, we're just extracting the transform on the points of each piece, and then we're doing a transform pieces to get back the animation onto it. So once the animation is back on the bike, we're doing a cache, and here we're reading the cache just so it's a bit faster to visualize. Once the bike is set up, it can be safely added to the bullet here, the bullet stream, or the Ragdoll stream rather, which we'll go over in just a second. Let's take it off at the top. So we've got a rig pose, just to put Eric in the right position on the bike. Rig stash pose, the classic REST transform storage. Afterwards, downstream of the rig stash pose, we have our configured joints. So this, in 18.5, has been known, or was known as FPIK configured joints. However, since then, we've added some updates to it and also made it more versatile. So now it's used for configuring specific attributes that could be used in multiple places, not only in the full body IK. To reflect this, we have a mode now at the top here, which can specify what purpose you're using this joint for, rather. So full body IK will expose everything to us. So local center of mass, rotation weights, limits, and so on and so forth. So this is the most complex one you can choose. Then we've got the Ragdoll, which is only rotation limits, because that's the only thing that Bullet cares about. And then we have the rig pose, which is more of encompassing both rotation and translation limits. So this could be used for rig pose, of course, or something like secondary motion SOP. This is mainly a convenience way to only visualize and interact with the attributes that make sense for your current setup. Then to dive a little bit into this node, we have here the name of the attribute we want to output, reading the REST transform that we define up here. Next up, we've got rotation order, but we see we have a rotation order up here, as well as for each multiparm entry. The rotation order is an important thing to configure properly, and that basically dictates how our joints are oriented. So the first component of the rotation order, so in our case RZ, represents the look at, so from parent to child, which we see here is Z. The second component, so the first one is also called the twist. Second component, RY, represents the twist axis, so the point towards the twist if this were an IK chain. That's how I like to think about it. So in our case, it would be the Y axis that we see up here. And then the last one is obviously the third axis. We can set the default rotation order of our skeleton up here. So we just set this to our Z, Y, and X because that's how our skeleton has been configured. If any of the joints that we're working with have a different orientation than the default, we can change it on their respective multiparm entry. This is something important to get right, both for Bullet and for any other SOP that will apply the limits. Next up, we have an option here, a compute tab, which would allow us to automatically compute limits, or when for using the full body IK mode, also local center of mass from specific inputs. So we're going to talk about limits in this scenario, and we can compute them from a motion clip. As we see up here, we have a third motion clip input. What this means is we could have a motion clip with a specific animation range that takes our skeleton through a nice variety of ranges of motion. Then the node, we look at that range of motion, and for each joint get the minimum and maximum rotation value on each axis and define the rotation limit that way. So this is a nice and convenient way, if you have access to such a motion clip, to create or to determine, to configure these limits faster and automatically. Another little thing I want to mention here, you can use, for example, multiple motion clips. So I could have multiple configured joint nodes in a line, like 2 or 3 or how many you want, each one using a different motion clip, each one configuring the limits for a specific joint group. So we could have a motion clip that takes care of like the ranges for the legs, one for the arms, etc., etc. And we could chain them like that, and the attribute will not be overridden as long as we set this group here properly. And next, for each configuration in the multi-param here, we see we got the actual rotations. And the best way to set this up is in the state. So we see here we're in the state. We have this nice HUD with showing us the values. You can hide the menu. And these orange boxes around the joints, which symbolize which joints have rotation limits configured. So in our case, we have quite a few. Not all of them need them, because not all of them will have collision shapes. If a joint will not have a collision shape, which we'll go into in a second down here, it won't be picked up by the solver anyway, so we don't have to bother with it. So if we click on joint, for example, shoulder L here, we get this new nice handle. You can press Shift 8 or Shift 7 for scaling the handle. And we see we have this these handles for all 3 axes, X, Y, and Z, colored correspondingly. We can take one of these bumps here and rotate it around, and this will basically configure the limit as we see fit. We can get a quite nice visualization of the current range, as we see the Z being the twist and the yellow thingy here being the other 2 axes. And a nice thing to mention is if you right click on the handle and go to handle parameters, we have this option which is off by default. So if you turn this one on, we get this extra information here of this line. So in this, for the twist, we get this blue line here. And for the other one, we get this yellow one with that little bump at the end. This is a nice and convenient way to visualize the current orientation of the joint. And by doing so, we can determine how we want to allow the joint to rotate. So we see here, it's oriented towards the child, so we want to rotate upwards or downwards by this much, this amount. Another thing I want to mention, especially when you're dealing with situations like these, when one side is mirrored compared to the other, we see that as I initialize the handles for the other side here, it's basically exactly the other way around, so it's flipped because the joint itself is flipped. Now this still makes sense in terms of values. We can still see the rotations correctly, and we can still properly work with this. But oftentimes it's easier to orient them towards the children because it just gives us more of a clear understanding on what we're working with. So we could press Shift F to flip the handle. The values will stay the same. Very important to note. However, the handles will be flipped, so now we can more easily basically work as we would on the other side as well, while visualizing it properly. So we can go ahead and, for each of these joints, define proper rotation limits. That makes sense for our current setup. And once we are done, these will all be stored in an attribute here that is called, in this case, FPAK joint config, because that's how we decided to call it. And in this dictionary attribute, we have a rest X form, which is the rest transform matrix that we defined the limits in. So in this case, this corresponds to our rest transform attribute that we define up here. Then we have it's also a local transform, by the way. So it's not exactly the same as this one, but it's computed from that one. And then we have the rotation lower limits and rotation upper limits in radians that we just defined. And rotation order, of course, as well. So these attributes will all be consumed by the Ragdoll constraints and then the solver. Moving down the chain, we have here our Ragdoll collision shapes node. This node we use to configure basically exactly what it says, collision shapes for our character. So we don't want to be sending the full skin geometry to Ragdoll, to Bullet, because that's not going to work properly. we want to define instead pieces of collision geometry for each joint that we're interested in or that we want to solve, that are quite, low res and simple to calculate. So the default that we see up here, you're using capsule shapes, but we can change this if we want to be box or spheres. We'll explain this a bit more in a second. To go over the node really quickly, we have our group here, so which joints we want to create collision shapes for. We don't have to generate collision shapes for all the joints, only the ones that make sense. So for example, any twist joint we can just leave out because that's just going to follow the parent nicely, and we don't want it to interact with the rest of the skeleton. Targets group, this is the same concept that we have going for the orient joint SOP. So in case you have a joint with multiple children, when you click on it and initialize the shape in the state, which will show, actually let's just do that now. You can copy it over here and plug that in there. I'll explain in a second why. Can nuke this. When I click on a joint, we see the shape gets initialized with some values here. This is on the local space of the joint. And it's basically going to be oriented towards the child to give us a nice head start. If, however, it has multiple children and it's going to pick a wrong one, we could correct that by specifying a targets group up there, choose the child that we want, and that's just going to help us a little bit with initializing it properly. Next, output group. This just outputs the joints that we have a shape for. So not only do they have to be up here in this group, but they also need to actually have that shape added. So if we check up here, we have a single joint in the collision joints group because we added a single shape. Rest pose attribute, said before, in this case we have none, but for the other one we do. We want to be defining these shapes on a rest stream, not a time dependent one. And that's the best way to determine on how that stream should be transformed. Then this mirror attribute, that's why I have this rig mirror pose up here. So we could use a rig mirror pose to create this mirror PT attribute, which is going to compute the skeleton mirroring for us. And then if we come up here to this state, make sure that mirror is on here. If I click, for example, on shoulder underscore L, it's going to create one for shoulder R at the same time. And as I transform them, they're going to be transformed in a mirror. Oh, this is just a convenience way to work in the state, configuring shapes for both the left and the right side simultaneously. Next up, we have the configure RBD properties per shape. So this is an extra little bit of information that we can attach to each shape. And this is specific to bullet, so it's something that the physical solver will read. And these attributes, you can read up on each one, what exactly it does and how it interacts with the bullet solver. Only one I want to mention is the density, because that's the one that's also visualized here, as we see that the colors have changed from white to blue. And the density basically tells the solver how heavy an object is based on its actual volume. So our shoulder at the moment with a density of 1 will its mass will be computed from how big the actual shape is times, well, since density is 1, mass can be deducted from this. We could, however, if we want to, increase the density of another joint, for example, to 10. And what this means is that this joint now is 10 times heavier than what its volume dictates. Generally, leaving them all to 1 or to default, if the shapes have been configured properly, should give you the right results. But sometimes playing with these values and getting specific areas or specific parts of a skeleton to be a bit heavier will make sense and will help with achieving what you're after. And then for the actual multiplier, again, what shape we want, box, capsule, or sphere. If you want to define a custom shape, you can, and I'll show you in just a second how. Since this is all SOPs, it becomes super easy. And we have here translate, rotate, scale, which again is in the local space of joint. So if we are to plug this here, we see that they remain correctly positioned according to the joints that we had going here. So they're not defined in world space. And that's it for this node. Now let's actually show really quickly how we can use custom. Actually, let's do it on this stream right here. So here are all the collision shapes that we have defined for our current example. What we could do is we can, let's say, isolate one. So we could use a split or something similar. We can select, for example, this one, isolate it. We can invert the selection to get it on this end of the stream here. And at this point, you could either modify it using an edit SOP or whatever, or you can even replace it altogether. For example, I could bring in a box, set it to polygons, pack it. So it has to be packed because everything upstream here is also packed. Then we can do an attribute transfer just to easily transfer every attribute that we had, which isn't really that much anyway. It's basically the name is the only one that's required. The other ones, bone capture and color, are just for convenience. And then we can do a merge. So we can merge this back in. Might want to position this slightly properly here so we get something sensible up there. And now if we take this result of the merge and plug it into the collision shapes of the Ragdoll constraints, now if we go to the solver, we can reset the simulation and we will see that the pelvis collision shape here changes to being a box. But this is a very simple way and method to create custom collision shapes for your joints if you want to. Next node in the chain is the Ragdoll constraints. So this one is a fairly simple node as it doesn't require much interaction from the user. This node creates the constraints between the collision shapes. So we see here these blue weird looking cone constraints are created between each collision shape. So if you come up here, we can display collision shapes and we see between each of them, we get this these constraints created. They are cones because they are limit constraints at the moment, but we have multiple types. So down here, for example, these ones are what's called a soft constraint, and the ones up here, it's what's called a hard constraint. We'll explain them briefly in just a second. So the purpose of this node mainly is to create these constraints automatically between the collision shapes that's going to hold them together during the solve. So they kind of stick together, creating this like proper shape of the character. Now the reason this node is exposed as a node in itself and it's not just integrated into the solver is because we can do some other things with it besides just creating these internal constraints that we have up here. A few options, you can read up on these, what each of these do and how do they affect the solve. We can also create external constraints, which we have for this example with the bike. So remember I said at the beginning that when we process the bike, we create a group for the handles. So if we visualize this group here, we see that the handles have been grouped and they have been stored in the cache, of course. We can bring the bike back and disable this one. So once we've run the collision shapes through this node, having the constraints be created for us, then we go ahead and we want to create additional set of external constraints to hold Eric onto the bike, right? So what we have here, we have three constraints that we've created. The first set is for the hands. So we select here which joint group we want, which in our case is the hands. The collision geometry is the target. So whatever we plug up here, which is the bike in this case. Then we want to constrain to the closest location on primitive. We can also do point, but in our case, primitive works better. And then what target of the primitives, which is the group handles that we've defined when we processed the actual bike. And then a couple of options for the actual constraint. We want a constraint time to be a hard constraint, so we can do glue, hard, or soft. The hard constraint means hold the hands pinned to the handle. They're not gonna like move or rotate or anything. They're gonna be literally stuck there, which is what we want, right? Because when we're riding a bike, we're holding quite tightly the grip on the handles. The next constraint here is for the feet. So down here, it is the same idea, except now we're doing a soft constraint with a quite high stiffness. So this effectively says it's kind of the same with this high stiffness. brings us closer to a hard constraint, but it's going to allow the feet to slightly rotate and transform just a little bit, so we get more fluidity in the motion. And then the last one, we've got the pelvis, which we constrain here using a soft again, no group, because it just wants the closest one to the seat. And this one has a lower stiffness because obviously you can go a bit freely on the seat. And last but not least, the actual engine of this whole solve, which is our Ragdoll solver. You can do a reset simulation. Now, I'm not going to go over all the parameters on this node because it's quite extensive, since it basically exposes a lot of what Bullet does. What's important to understand is that, one, it is a solver. So as all the other solvers, we have the classic reset sim, the start frame, time scale, number of substeps, so on and so forth. We've got, we can do a ground plane, being like just a default ground plane that we can just transform, or a height field, so we can import a custom height field and use that as a ground if we want to. In this case, we don't, of course. Then under collision geometry, this is an important bit I want to touch on. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our RBD here, our RBD configure, besides just packing each by piece, it also creates these active and animated attributes. So these attributes, we can check this box right here. It says override attributes from SOP, and that's going to override the state of our object using these active and animated attributes. So at this moment, our initial object type doesn't really matter anymore, and it's just going to use whatever we specify under active and animated. If, however, we do not have active and animated, deforming is also an option, attributes, our initial object type will be saying to the solver what the object is and should just be or stay at. So animated static is what we want for this example. We have a couple of options here. You can read up on all what of each of those do. The animated static basically means animate the object, make it static as to it acts as a collider and nothing else. So it's not being affected by physics in any way, shape or form. It just makes other objects collide with it. And then some of the other attributes that we also see on the collision shapes node can be configured for the collision geometry as well. Then under Ragdoll, we have the classic race transform with what's the frame range. A couple of options here. We want to allow initial violation of limit. So that means if any joint is outside of its rotation limit, it's not going to pop into place as we start the solve, but rather will nicely transition back to where or it's not going to be allowed to rotate further outside. It's going to slowly being brought back to where it should be. We can override the constraints from up here. So this means that at each time step, we can reread those constraints in, and that's only useful when you have time-dependent constraints. For the elephant scene, we have something like that set up, so we'll talk about a bit more there. Then partial ragdoll. This is useful if we want to only affect a portion of a character. In this case, or the default rather, is the joints with collision shapes. Since our full character has collision shapes, or at least the full body of it, we're going to get a full body solve. But we could do custom joint group or even disabled, which will just run on all the joints. Anyway, effectively these two are the same in this case, but sometimes if only a few joints are configured, we could set it up like that. So for example, you could only have like the hand of the character be affected by Ragdoll while the other part just follows the animation. Pinroot collision shapes, mainly useful in that case as well, where only the hand is affected, but we want to pin the hand to the rest of the body. We could tick that option. Then a few options here for the stiffness, overall stiffness of the character. Motors, which is, so the joints in the group here, the solver, as it solves, will try to keep those joints or rotated in the original, or try and sort of push them towards what the animation dictates, but at the same time they'll still be influenced by the by the physics solver. So for this case, we have the spine and the head, because we don't want them to just completely like go left and right and be like super like easy to transform. So we see them that they stick relatively nicely and straight, and this is because we have the motors on only for those joints. And then under transitions, we're going to talk about transitions in just a second, showing a couple other examples. And that's basically it. So we run the solver, we can bring all these inputs, which is our skeleton, constraints, collide geometry, and collision geometry. So this is the collision shapes, this is the collision geometry, so the bike. And that gives us that result that we are after. Before we close this example, I want to go over a couple of more simple examples here, just to showcase some options that we have going with the transitions that I just mentioned. So here is a very basic setup of our same character Eric running and a flying random wooden bat that strikes him, make him kind of go like a proper ragdoll back, like a rubber, almost rubber character here. So two things I want to mention for this example in particular. The one is the setup of the actual bat. So we're creating a bat up here, just a simple geometry. We're using the RBD material fracture to fracture it. So this is sort of the first interesting point here. RBD configure, remember I've mentioned this before, where now all of a sudden we want to have the actual geometry, a constraint geometry, as well as a proxy geometry because we're fracturing it. So using RBD configure makes more sense now. That's why it's a good habit to use it. Plus, the active and animated bits here are also animated because we want our bat to animate up until it hits our character. And the moment that happens, we want it to go into physics so it breaks apart. Then we're doing an RBD pack, so we bring all these streams together. Down here is a simple setup with just adding one single joint for it, and then we're just using a capture packed geo of this whole packed stream. So this is also a very nice thing here. We can just use all of our packed objects and transform them by the same joint, and this will give us the result of the bat being animated and then turn to active in the solve. And then we'll come back to the actual solve itself. So for this one we have a ground plane, of course, since our character we want them to be stopped by this ground plane. And under transitions we're using the one that's called RBD impact data. So this one will calculate the impact force between two RBD objects. So in this case is the bat and our Eric character. So collision object is the default which we're using to basically say our input collision geometry should be used for the impact. You can add multiple objects if you have them or if you want to. Joint group here also we can specify what joints of our character, so what collision shapes effectively should be calculating this RBD impact data. So you might not want all of them. And the impact threshold, which is just how strong the force should be. And once you specify all of this stuff, the moment two RBD objects collide, once their force is higher than 10, then we will send our character to Ragdoll, which is a nice and fun experiment to play with, as you can get some nice transitions happening. Before continuing, let's look at a few final thoughts related to the Ragdoll workflow. The first point I want to make is that you have to remember that not all joints really require a collision shape or a rotation limit. So even when not dealing with partial ragdolls, as in only want to apply ragdoll for an arm, for example, even when dealing with full body skeletons, not all joints need to have that collision shape. Only the joints that actually make sense in the structure of the skin, basically the body of the character, right? So again, the example I gave before, a twist joint does not need a collision shape as to it's not meant to be collided against. Same stands for rotation limits. Not all joints need them. You can specify on the Ragdoll constraints if a joint does not have rotation limits, whether to allow it to rotate freely or to not allow it to rotate at all. So you have that bit of control when dealing with things that don't really require configuration. Next up, remember concave shapes are not great for bullet, so where possible, try and limit those, convert them to convex ones, and keep the geometry nice and light. The optional collision geometry input, so in our case the bike, has to be a packed geometry, so that's an important bit, otherwise it won't work. And of course, remember when dealing with more complex collision geometries, like we've shown in the bat example, so when we have geometry, constraints, and proxy geometry, then using something like the RBD pack will pack everything nicely into an RBD packed object that also can be read by the Ragdoll nodes. And last but not least, this is something we did not cover, so it's important to mention here. Bullet is quite sensitive to scaling, so it expects proper scaling in terms of unit size. If your character is off, so it doesn't stick to the proper unit scale, then you might want to adjust the bullet world scale parameter on the node just to make sure that all constraints behave as expected. Next up, we want to have a look, a quick look, that is, at the elephant scene, which basically takes everything we've talked about so far and layers them together into this nice workflow that really emphasizes this back and forth between rigger, technical animator, and how we can apply these secondary effects in a procedural manner to achieve the desired effect. So back in Houdini, this time, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a quick look at the elephant scene. Now this scene was fairly complex to build, but at the same time very fun. So I'm going to dive into it and sort of step by step go through the tools we already discussed, just to show how they can be used or how they were used here specifically. So we come up here, actually just do a quick play beforehand. We see the elephant moving, the ears are secondary motion SOP, the tail, the trunk as well, and this bit is the ragdoll. And then the video actually had the getup as well. I'll explain at the end how that was achieved. So we're importing our elephant model here. We're doing the classic rest transform. And then here we've got the ragdoll configuration. So here we're defining limits for our joints. So it's basically what we've discussed before. We see that all of them, almost all of them, quite a lot of them, have limits configured for this example. Then we're defining collision shapes for our character here. This is a good example where I had to change the density, or I tweaked the density slightly in the back of the elephant, just to get a bit of more of that heavy feel to it, since the shapes themselves aren't very big compared to the rest of the trunk or whatever. So playing with the density gave us a bit of better results when the elephant folds. Then here we're bringing in a ground, which is just a basic platform that he's running on. And then the ragdoll constraints. Now, one thing to mention, you can see that they're offset. And the reason is because that's the rest transform. So this is where our elephant starts. But as he actually walks forward, we wanted to keep that forward momentum in the animation. Because when we run the ragdoll solver, we wanted to basically get that inertia transferred to the ragdoll and have it solve like that, and only after it has solved, transfer it back to origin to render it. So for our ragdoll constraints here, we have the internal constraints classics, and for external constraints, we're adding one for our left foot, so the foot in the back, right there, all the way to a specific point on the platform, which will basically be the closest point to the elephant's leg as he reaches the frame that we're interested in. So in this case, it was, I believe, 142. So around frame 142, the elephant will be here. And this external constraint is there to make that trip happen. So basically, he'll, at that frame, the glue, because it's a glue constraint, will get activated. It's going to make him trip, and then the constraint itself will be elastic enough because it's a glue constraint. And then also just to make sure it's not going to cause any issues afterwards, we're blasting the constraint here. So after that frame, as we run, we see it gets blasted. So if you remember when we were talking about the Ragdoll solver that I mentioned here, override external constraints from SOP, this is an example where we would want to use those. So by checking this box, the solver will at each time step check that external constraints to update any changes. So the moment that constraint disappears, aka we blast it with a simple blast SOP, the solver will know and will stop making that foot, or the leg, the foot in this case, be affected by that constraint. So that's that. And then for the solver itself, we all have a simple time transition. So after frame 142, we want to, as you see it, basically here exactly what I meant, the closest point to the platform. And around here, we want it to transition. So we see this leg gets stuck for about 3 frames. So you get this sort of tripping motion, and then he falls down. And that's how when the ragdoll is enabled. Collision geometry, we also have the platform here propagating through. This is also just to get this nice interaction with the platform itself, which is a static object here, so no need for the active or animated attributes. And that is basically the ragdoll setup. So nothing terribly new except this little like blasting of constraints. It's a fairly classic workflow full bullet, but it's worth mentioning here. And then on this side right here, we have the secondary motion SOP configurations. So we're still in rest pose. We are defining some different limits from the ragdoll ones. So the ragdoll ones use the classic fbak join config default name attribute. And then here we define this as ears join config, for example, where we add some limits for the ears and also for the tail as well, just to get that rotations that we're interested in. Then one of the important points that we presented for the secondary motion SOP was the usage of point attributes to drive these effects to get a nice variety. And this is exactly what we're doing here. So for the right ear, we're creating some attributes on a few joints, because we can see that the ears are defined by 4 joints. So we're creating some attributes to drive those effects on the ear on both the right and the left side. Then in this node, we have a simple attribute copy, which applies the animation that we got straight from our animator. So we see the elephant just walking here and keep walking, basically. So that's the simple FBX animation. And then we can start to apply our effects. So the first one, we're doing an ear base. So we're applying a secondary motion on that joint right there, point 27 and 12 of the ears on both sides. And since we're driving them with attributes, we can get some nice variety there. Then we're doing the ear mid, so the middle joints, basically those two again on both sides. The tip was not necessary since it's not really skinned to anything, so that's constitutes the ears. Then we move down to the tail, which we can also do in one blast with this node. Also worth mentioning that you can see that all of these nodes have the modify in place turned off. This is because we're chaining them together, so it's no point in transferring the effect onto the skeleton up until this point, the last one here. And this one is tail up. So one thing that I had to do was to limit or to change the effect, basically dampen the effect a bit more between quadruped walk and the biped walk. So we see on the quadruped we have 2.5 on the effect multiplier. Here we have 1. We could have probably animated this, but the way I chose to do it is to just use the blend options here. So we're blending out of this effect at frame 60, and then we're blending back into this one at frame 65. So this creates this nice transition with the tail. And then for the trunk, we're using again something we've shown before, where we're using the joint at the tip of the trunk. We apply the effects on its position. So as we play, we can see it kind of going crazy. And then we run a full body IK. We could have also run on like a curve solver or something like that. I just chose the full body IK because it's a little easier, and we get this nice motion on the trunk. So once all of the effects have been applied, we can just connect that animation to our Ragdoll solver, and we see it play as we did before. And then this little section down here, this is just so that we can put the motion to be in place for our render. So if we go to this view, we're extracting locomotion. This is just a very simple setup. We're extracting locomotion so we keep him in place. And then when the actual ragdoll happens, we still want it to go forward a little bit to get to sell that tripping motion. So how we're achieving that is we're clamping this version with the extracted locomotion to frame 143, which is the frame at which it trips. Okay. And then inside of the applied locomotion here, we're computing that delta between this stream and this stream. So that means that all the way up to frame 143, this delta will just be identity because they're matching, they're exactly identical, right? You see? And then after 143, they change. And at this point, the locomotion joint also changes. So we see it's gonna go quite far, but we see that that one stays behind and this one keeps going because that one's been clamped. So we want to take only this delta here and we apply this back onto the pelvis joint that we used to extract it from in the first place. And once we do that, then we have a little skeleton blend just to control how much we actually want it to jump forward in space. We might not want it 1, and we see here we had about 80%. And then this last rig pose here, just a few touches on the tail, just to make sure we don't get too crazy of a protrusion when he stands up here. So if we disable this, we see that on stand up we get some intersections here with the leg. So to fix that, it's easier to just use a rig pose and do a couple of keyframes. And with that, this concludes this example. I wanted to also mention before we wrap up here that the trip, or what you saw at the beginning with the nicer trip and then the get up, that was achieved by basically, so once we've got this setup in place and we've went through all the ragdoll bits, we stopped the motion at a specific frame, 200 and something. Then I sent the motion again back to the animator, who took it, animated the get up, worked a bit on the trip to make it more believable, and then sent the motion back to me. And we've run it again through some of the secondary motion bits for the ears, just to get that some of that the motion back onto the get up as well. And that was the final render. So it was a very nice back and forth, as I mentioned before. This scene definitely deserves more explanations and more in-depth dive in terms of workflow than we can cover in this presentation of the Hive. But it should hopefully give you a nice idea on how we would approach layering these effects together and applying the secondary motion as well as Ragdoll to achieve a desired effect. Before we close things off, a few thoughts related to the previously shown scene. So a very important one is make sure you do the configurations on a non-time dependent stream. So you've seen there that all of our limits, configurations, collision shapes, Ragdoll constraints, attributes were all done before we applied the animation. And even though all of these nodes take a rest transform to make sure that they still get applied in a rest space, not having a time-dependent stream pass through them will make sure that we optimize the scene as much as possible. Next one, we've used the collision geometry input in this case for a custom ground plane. So even though on the ground plane, on the Ragdoll solver itself, you have an option for a ground plane that's by default, so we just get a transform or a height field. If we want to use any type of SOP geometry as a ground plane, basically, we can just use the fourth input, and that's going to work the same way. And last but not least, of course, most importantly, when playing with these little effects, have as much fun as possible. Building all of this scene was very, very nice. Basically get to experiment with tweaking some values and seeing the effect happen in real time. And getting some of those nice Ragdoll results is a blast. Thank you very much everyone for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation about the secondary motion tools that we added in KineFX for Houdini 19. And of course, if you have any questions or feedback, do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you and have a great day.